Welcome and hello, everybody. I'm Deanna Cohen, CEO and co-founder at Plastic Pollution Coalition. Thank you for joining this special webinar event, How Plastics Fueled the LA Wildfires and How to Rebuild Better. Plastic Pollution Coalition is a nonprofit communications and advocacy organization that collaborates with an expansive global alliance of organizations, businesses, and individuals to create a more just, equitable, and regenerative world free of plastic pollution and its toxic impacts. So to get started, we have 4 poll questions today. These are to get a sense of who's joining us, and each question will only appear for about 20 seconds. So please answer quickly. Poll question 1, where are you joining us from today? Well, I can already see it looks like the majority of folks are joining us from North America, but there are a few people tuning in from Europe or North Asia. So welcome, welcome. Let's go to poll question number 2. What best describes the area of focus of your work? Well, I can already see it's a really interesting spread of people. The majority looks like about more than 30% is coming from the nonprofit world, but there are also people tuning in from government and policy, education, academia, students, business, healthcare, the media, and research, as well as arts and entertainment. So that's great. Let's go to poll question 3. Have you ever been directly impacted by a wildfire? So it looks like about 8% of the people tuning in, of that, some have lost their home, business, or workplace in a wildfire, and some have been displaced by it. It looks like almost 50% of us do know people who have been impacted by fires. And then the rest of you who are tuning in, thank you for tuning in. It's important for us to learn as much as we can. So let's go to poll question 4. Why do you think wildfires are getting worse? And please select all answers that apply. Well, I think the most obvious answer here is that 96% of the folks tuning in believe that climate change plays a role, but it looks like it's across the board. Urban development, plastic and building materials, loss of indigenous land stewardship, irresponsible or criminal handling of fire, illegal fireworks, improper facilities management, and under-resourced emergency services. So thank you for participating in the poll questions, and thanks for joining us today. Plastic Pollution Coalition is honored to present this special event, How Plastics Fueled the LA Wildfires and How to Rebuild Better. Today, we have a roundtable discussion with our panelists about the recent wildfires that ravaged multiple communities here in Los Angeles. A city I myself have called home my entire life. Oh my God, I'm getting emotional, sorry. While the fires have been extinguished, impacted families, communities, and businesses have a long road ahead that involves cleanup, rebuilding, reseeding, and so much more, all while bearing in mind the health risks caused by these devastating fires. Plastic and building materials in household goods, in underground pipes, and more burned in the fires, releasing toxic fumes and residue that continue to impact our air, water, and soil here in Los Angeles and the surrounding areas. We're joined today by a wonderful expert panel who will help us understand the impacts of these fires in our plasticized world and how we can make the right changes moving forward to rebuild a better, more resistant, and plastic-free world. Joining our discussion, we're going to hear from Silverio Caggiano, Cassidy Clarity, and Tevin Hamilton. First, I'd like to introduce Silverio Caggiano. Silverio is a retired battalion chief from the Youngstown Fire Department, having served for 39 years. He is also a Buckeye Environmental Network board member. He is a hazardous materials specialist, paramedic, and hazmat and fire instructor. Silverio now works as an expert consultant and recently advised the law firms that sued Norfolk Southern for the East Palestine train derailment. Silverio's expert opinions can be found in multiple oil and gas-related reports, documentaries, and in publications. Welcome, Silverio, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce the rest of the panelists. Next, I'd like to introduce Cassidy Clarity. Cassidy is a materials researcher at Habitable, where she seeks to understand the chemical makeup of materials and their impact on people and the planet throughout product life cycles. She and her team translate this comprehensive research into intuitive rankings and actionable guidance to help everyone select better building materials. She also worked in public health research on a range of studies from food insecurity and diabetes to bisphenol A, BPA exposure in children. Welcome, Cassidy. Now I'd like to introduce Tevin Hamilton, our final panelist. Tevin is the coalition coordinator for the Environmental Justice Communities Against Plastic Coalition, or EJCAP, at Physicians for Social Responsibility, LA, where he leads efforts to address plastic pollution across California. Tevin's passion for environmental justice began at Southern University and A&M College in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he witnessed the devastating impact of petrochemical plants on communities in Cancer Alley, a region heavily affected by environmental degradation and health issues. Tevin remains dedicated to advocating for marginalized communities and advancing environmental equity. Welcome, Tevin. So now I'd like to invite all of our panelists to come on camera to begin our discussion. And we'll start by asking some questions which were submitted by attendees ahead of time. But please, again, feel free to add additional questions in the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to answer them live. Welcome, you guys. To get us all started, I'm going to begin with this first question, which was submitted. For communities near the fire zones, is particulate matter affecting their land and environment? And I'd like to start with you, Tevin.
Thank you, Deanna. And just before I get started, I want to say what an honor it is to be here, to be a part of the discussion, and just be a part of this panel. So thank you for this opportunity. And I'm hoping to really shed light on some of these issues and how it's affecting low-income communities. So to dive right into the question, I think the first thing to even start talking about before we talk about how the particulate matter is affecting us is to kind of understand how the particulate matter is getting into the environment in the first place. So a lot of things that people don't know is that plastics are actually made from fossil fuels. And when you make them from fossil fuels, when they're burned, they relieve a bunch of toxic chemicals into the air. These toxic chemicals include biphenyls, dioxins, furans, heavy metals, nitrogen oxides, and a plethora of other ones. So because it's linked to fossil fuels and when they're burned, they release those type of chemicals such as particulate matter. So to answer the question at hand, so our communities are affected by, is the land environment affected by particulate matter? The answer is 100% absolutely yes. And that's because when those chemicals are burned, as mentioned, the dioxins, the hydrocarbons, and the chlorine can spread through the air and get into our soil, get into our water, and get into our air. We breathe those things in, and then it can cause us significant health impacts such as respiratory and developmental conditions such as hormone disruption and even cancer. So it's important for us to really understand that there are these impacts from this particulate matter can cause us health impacts across generations. There are certain groups of people who are more at risk than other ones for particulate matter and other harmful chemicals, and those groups include children, pregnant people, the elderly, and people with already pre-existing chronic diseases such as diabetes, kidney disease, and heart disease. So it's really important for us to understand how these things are happening in the first place. And something that's often underlooked is how much plastics are in our homes in the first place, from our flooring to our walls, to the pipes in our plumbing, to our electronics, to the carpeting. All these things are contributing to the dioxins and the particulate matter that is emitted into the air when the fires took place.
Thank you. I was wondering, Silverio or Cassidy, if you'd like to add anything to that.
One of the considerations with particulate matter, once it falls back down to earth, it gets into the ground. And if you plant a garden, things like dioxins and some of these other, heavy metals can be, taken up into the vegetables that you're growing in your gardens, and then you consume them. And it gets into the biocycle, and it enters into, your bodies. And one of the things that we were worried about with the polyvinyl chloride fires, or the vinyl chloride fires down in East Palestine, was the dispersal of dioxins. They always try to minimize this stuff. And in California, you have the same thing going on with the battery plant fire. You've got hydrogen fluorides that are being put out there, and once it hits the water, it becomes hydrofluoric acid. And I've seen people with burns and stuff like that. But you can also uptake this stuff with animals. The animals will eat this stuff, and I like to use the analogy, like it might be a little bit, but like here in the north, we might get a little bit of snow, but when we shovel it, it becomes a nice pile. So imagine your pet or your chickens or whatever eating this stuff, and it's consuming them, it's setting into their fats, and then when you eat them, it enters into it enters into your body and it gets mainstreamed in there. So adequate testing is imperative here.
Yeah, I'll just add adequate testing is imperative. I'll underscore that to say that I think for the wildland urban interface, for the fires like we're seeing in LA, there are still a lot of unknowns in terms of what lingers afterwards in the soil and the environment. We have pretty good research. Silverio, maybe you can comment to this about wildland fires generally, but just because of the wildland urban interface fires are becoming more intense and more frequent, there might be just less research in general in that area. But we do know, for instance, when building materials are burning, we have some research about what's being produced in terms of chemical emissions. And we're hoping that studies that are going to be happening after the LA fires can shed some light on some of the things that will be sticking around in the soil. Dioxins have come up a little bit. Those are persistent compounds. They don't break down in the environment very easily. They can spread and bioaccumulate, as Silverio was mentioning, but there are, PAHs and things that off-gas in a shorter amount of time. There's heavy metals also can stick around in the soil. So all of these things we know can be produced when building materials burn, but I think the scale of a wildland fire, but the scope of a city, these wildland urban interface fires are somewhat new-ish. And so additional research forthcoming will hopefully shed some light on or make the connections between what's burning in our cities and then what's being left behind.
Well, that was a lot of amazing information for the first question. So thank you all for that. Question 2. This may be a question for Silverio, but others are welcome to answer as well. Firefighting foam is frequently full of PFAS chemicals, forever chemicals. Does this require special cleanup from areas after fires? And what steps are being taken to eliminate PFAS from firefighting foam?
PFAS in itself has become the bane of the fire service. Every state is kind of doing their own thing, but fortunately, California has banned the use of PFAS in the AFFF being aqueous film forming foam is what it's called. They banned it in 2000, and the only place they use it as is refineries and gas stations. New Hampshire, Washington, Arizona, Vermont, New Jersey, or New York, Alaska, and Connecticut have also banned that. Now, other states have went on their own and used grant funding or EPA funding, which probably is going to go away, to replace their foam with non-film, non-PFAS or PFOA bearing foam. There are states like my own that hasn't done a darn thing, and we're still arguing at what to do with their foam. They're trying to get something together. They're trying to get money together. Lord only knows what's going to happen in the next few weeks as to where the funding is going to come from. But the problem that you run into with that stuff is Dayton, Ohio, at the Air Force Base, they would always test their foam systems. And then they just flush it down into the sewers and it got into the water system. And the next thing you know, they have forever chemicals in their drinking water in Dayton, Ohio. And this has repeated itself. It's repeated itself with the oil and gas industry. They found that they were using PFAS as a surfactant when they were drilling wells, and the stuff was being dumped into injection wells, and it was in the cuttings that were coming to the dumps, and the leachate was getting pumped out and sent to wastewater treatment plants, and they weren't treating for PFAS. So it was passing through the system and getting into the rivers, and downstream someone's using it as drinking water. So PFAS has become a problem, and it's become a problem even with us firefighters because it's in our turnout gear, the water retardant that has been put in our turnout gear. And we'll discuss that in a later question. But we've been exposed to it for years. And it was one of the reasons why when I would fight a fire, the first thing I do is I take my coat off if it wasn't too darn cold. Or when I became a battalion chief, I just didn't wear my coat as much as humanly possible because I didn't want the contact with it. So PFAS is becoming a huge thing. It can be decontaminated. And if you use PFAS, you must tell the EPA that you've used it. And the cleanup companies are supposed to come and clean it up. As to how good of a job they do, I can't tell you. But that's how it's handled, at least in my world.
Interesting. I'll go to the next question. This is a question for Cassidy. How can plastic used in our built environment be reduced? I love solutions.
Good. Well, if anybody has solutions, let us know because this is a huge problem. In fact, this is what we're mostly working on most days here at Habitable. So a good first step is identifying which products contain plastic, which can be trickier than you'd even think. Building material manufacturers are not required to disclose the contents of their products. For instance, some people don't fully appreciate that your typical carpet is made of plastic or your typical wall paint is all plastic. Many common insulation materials are also plastic. So we address this at Habitable by doing really in-depth research of chemical content of building materials and generating guidance on what to use in our Informed tool, which is freely available on our website. The guidance is not just about plastic, it's about all chemical hazards across the entire product life cycle. And I'm sure this comes up a lot in these webinars, but we aren't just concerned with the polymer itself, but with all the chemicals that make the polymer work in a plastic product as well, because those chemicals can and do add hazards. So our guidance helps select better products, considering all hazards. And no surprise, the more heavily plastic products tend to be ranked worse than the no or low plastic products. So we also have other resources. We have a new policy brief that has that more explicitly calls out no and low plastic materials. So hopefully we can share that around after the webinar. But so as Los Angeles rebuilds, certainly there's an opportunity for homeowners to make better material choices. We hope they do. We hope they use our guidance. But if we're really going to address plastics and building materials, we need bigger solutions. Buildings are currently the second largest user of plastics next to packaging. I think they're more thought of as durable goods, but the scale of the built environment is just so huge. And in fact, between 2020 and 2060, the whole building stock is set to double. So that's a lot of plastic and not currently a lot of interventions that are focused on the built environment. But there's good news. In almost every material category that we've researched, there are viable alternative materials available today that are no or lower plastic and less hazardous. So we have some solutions. So in addition to our personal research or personal choices, we need some market pressure, which can look like large purchasers sending a signal to the market by preferring these better alternatives. We've worked with architecture firms or affordable housing developers, any developers. We've had some success in the past with big box stores. And in a similar vein, we can hope to influence green building standards to reward better material use and penalize the continued use of the worst materials. And then, of course, we need policy initiatives at every level. And this could look like government procurement policies that prefer no and low plastic materials, or mandates where public spaces aren't contributing to the problem, or state level bans like we've seen with PFAS. And then certainly governments with fire prone areas like LA and California more broadly, they have additional incentive to consider building material policies. And hopefully, like I've mentioned before, the research in the wake of the LA fires will help clarify those links between the materials we've been building with and then the cleanup that has to happen and the public health impact that happens after.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to that because I want to go into solutions as we talk through this, but I have a question right now for Tevin.
Oh, can I add something to what Cassidy was saying? Because I think what she was saying is so important to uplift. I think it's really important that we really use the safest materials possible when we're in our rebuilding efforts, when we're rebuilding these buildings and structures. I think that is a point that we cannot afford to overlook. I think one of the biggest problems in that, though, is that plastic material is oftentimes so much cheaper, and that is oftentimes the reason why that's being used. So in our rebuilding efforts and our rebuilding strategies, we really need to think about, is there a possibility of like public investments into the building materials to make it that it's safer in these homes in the first place. Because if we keep just putting back the same materials, the same problems can continue happening. And I also think, to another point Cassidy was saying, I think we just need more transparency from the agencies and the rebuild efforts of what's in the materials that we're using. If we kind of know what's in there, we can make smarter and more informed decisions in making sure that these buildings are more safe going forward and down the line.
Yeah, I totally hear you. I was gonna take us here a little later, but let me just ask both of you, like, and also Silverio, like, are there specific materials that are generically used in homes that are plastic? Because some come to mind for me, like PVC pipes, but I just was wondering if you could throw out a little bit of that info for the people tuning in.
Yeah, PVC is a big one. And in fact, building and construction is the largest user of PVC. And pipes are the largest user of the building and construction use of PVC. So that's definitely a good place to go. And Silverio can comment with your hazardous management background or hazardous waste management background, but PVC is pretty terrible from every point along the life cycle. It's not, the polymer itself is not as hazardous in use, but it from the moment that it's created and then when it's burned in fires as well, it is a pretty hazardous product. And so, and for most of the products for which PVC is used, there are non-PVC products available for the same use. And in some cases, Tevin, no cost or performance difference. It just depends on the product category. That's a great point, though, that we need to always keep in mind about cost and performance. But yeah, PVC it was another point that I was hoping to make, is if we need to focus efforts, then focusing them on the worst in class materials first should be top priority. And PVC, I think, is one of those.
Yeah, and just to help make that connection for everyone, again, what Silverio was talking about with the train derailments in East Palestine, they were carrying vinyl chloride, which is the base used to make PVC, polyvinyl chloride. So this is all interconnected, the whole chain, when you look at how toxic it is for people. And then we use it in all these different ways in our homes and building and for agriculture, et cetera. So there's a need for a real rethink there. I know that one of our projects as Plastic Pollution Coalition is called Filtered Not Bottled. And in that project, we are making recommendations that during lead pipe replacement across the United States, that encouraging people to replace not with plastic PVC pipes, but to replace with copper or recycled copper pipes. And then also making recommendations to provide filters for people so they can filter water during that period of time versus needing to buy plastic bottled water. Did anyone have anything else they wanted to add to that part of the conversation? I mean, to me, this is a really robust part of the conversation that I'd like to be able to share with people what they could use instead in terms of building materials. So
just from a fire point of view, fires in our fire service have become mini hazmat spills. And that's because of all the polyvinyl chlorides, because of all the plastics, because of all the hydrocarbon-based things that are going into our homes. And that's the drill baby drill part. They're not worried about getting cheaper gas for your house. They're not worried about getting more oil for your cars. They're worried about making plastics because we use so much of it. And when we have house fires, your more progressive departments come out of a house fire and they actually decon down our firefighters. We scrub them down. We have another set of turnout at the fire station. When they come out of the fire, they get scrubbed down rudimentarily with Dawn dish soap and all that other stuff. And they take the turn. If it's warmer climate, you can take the turnout gear off. If not, you get back and you put your gear into the extractors and get them clean. But all the plastics have given rise to a bunch of problems within the fire service. We just had to deal with carbon monoxide back in the day. Old firefighters I got, I'd say, hey, back when I was there, all you had wool or cotton couches that were stuffed with, hair and springs. the pillows are all made of flies. Nowadays this stuff, this stuff is noxious, and it is. You not only have the carbon monoxide, but you also have the hydrogen cyanide. And what happens with us firefighters is if we're exposed to both the carbon monoxide and the hydrogen cyanide, it mimics a heart attack. And I have went into emergency rooms and specifically trained emergency department physicians. If you have a firefighter that comes in that's been in a fire and he is displaying signs and symptoms of a heart attack, just don't assume it's the carbon monoxide. Also assume that he has had hydrogen cyanide poisoning and treat for both, because once you've blown off the CO from the lungs, the cyanide is working on the organs. And I don't know how many people have seen the one show where the father died in the fire and he was fine. He blew off the CO. And then later on, he ended up having the heart attack. Well, that's classic. That's classic. He got the CO out from the oxygen, and they didn't get the hydrogen cyanide out. So it's a whole new world out there. And we're going to touch on that a little bit later about some of the stuff that's actually out there.
Mhm.
But
Silverio, were you referring to the show This Is Us?
yes, that's the one. This Is Us. The father was a classic. When I was watching it, I said, yeah, that guy ended up with hydrogen cyanide poisoning because he was fine and then had a heart attack. And that's classic. That's the classic. If you look up the symptoms, that's the classic sign and symptom of it. And it was killing firefighters until we really made, the connection as to what was there. But we'll get more into some of the other stuff at later questions.
Sure, that sounds good. I had a question. It may be slightly moot at this point though, Tevin, so you can just bring me along. But what are the risks that you are experiencing from an EJCAP perspective associated with rebuilding on land where homes, cars, buildings have been burnt? And how are you seeing those lingering contaminants affect the areas?
So I think it's important to say there's a lot of risk in rebuilding in these areas because of all the things we're talking about. When those homes were burned and all these harmful chemicals are emitted and released, they can get into the air, the groundwater, into the soil and last several decades and generations. And when you plant your food, when you're just living there, you're being exposed to these different things. When you rebuild in these areas where the soil is contaminated, it can include heavy metals like lead, it can have asbestos, biphenyls, dioxins, and a bunch of other chemicals like that can cause serious health effects. So I think whenever we're rebuilding, there are two things that I think we need to prioritize: a safe recovery and a just recovery. And when I say safe, I mean we have to be very intentional about when we rebuild these homes and rebuild these buildings and rebuild these businesses, that we're really taking the time. We need to ensure that there's no harm that could come down the line. And we also need to have a just recovery because, there is a lot of toxic debris. I think I saw a stat was 4 million tons, up to 4 million tons of debris. And the problem is, where are we going to put all that? So there's a lot of talk about, putting it in local like landfills, but we know some communities have kind of actively protested against that. To give a real example, Calabasas, they're trying to actively avoid putting some of those toxic debris in their landfills because they don't want to expose them to their children and their schools and their homes, which makes sense. But at the same time, no, we can't afford to shift that onto other communities. A lot of the things they're talking about, they want to kind of send that toxic waste and toxic toxic debris to other EJ low-income communities across the state. But it's really important. That's not a just recovery if we're just shifting our burden onto someone else. So we need to be really intentional about how we're going to figure out how we're going to dispose this. And I guess I want to say an equitable way, but the solution isn't to put it on the community who may not have the means or the resources to do it, to fight back as a more affluent area like Calabasas can. And another thing when we're rebuilding that's extremely important, it is imperative that we protect CEQA at all costs. There's no reason we should suspend CEQA. It's one of the few tools we have to ensure that when rebuilding and development is happening, that the corporations and the companies who are trying to do oil drilling and different things like that can't do whatever they want to do.
Tevin,
CEQA mainly, go ahead.
can you tell us what the acronym CEQA is for?
California Environmental Quality Act, yeah. So what the purpose of CEQA is to ensure that when we're building that no harms are coming from doing that type of stuff. So when CEQA was lifted, which it literally was, it means when they go back in there and rebuild, those businesses and those corporations can rebuild without any rules or regulations about what can happen at all. It doesn't really affect single homes, single family homes at all. So the whole logic that is being used to help rebuild faster is really helping to rebuild faster and unsafer for the corporations as opposed to the single family homes. Corporations are already buying that land to try to use it for whatever they want. And we already know there's a good possibility that that land is contaminated. So that can, if they build businesses there, that can expose new workers and other things like that. So we just need to make sure when we're building, we're doing it in a safe way because we want to prioritize human health and safety, and we want to do it in a just way and not transition our burden onto others.
Yeah, under the federal government's Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or what we call RCRA, there are guidelines as to what to do with contaminated, construction or industrial waste. There are places that can and cannot accept it. The unfortunate part is we're not only talking about environmental justice here, we're talking about human justice, because most of these landfills end up in throwaway communities, poor, minority, uh, you know, uh, lowly represented communities, and that's where they end up. And they're not, the waste management business is not the only, corporation that does that. There's many of them, including the oil and gas industry. Like in Hawaii, when they had the fires there, they're islands. What do they do with that stuff? What are they going to do with it? And those are things that we've got to look at long term, not only getting rid of what's here now, but in the future, if this happens again, Lord knows it probably will, given the environmental problems that we're having, are we going to repeat the same mistakes?
Yeah. Thank you for those answers. Cassidy, during the recent fires in Los Angeles, was the air in nearby cities impacted by the toxic chemical release, even if air quality readings appeared normal? I know they were appearing normal on my iPhone, so I'm curious.
Well, this is stretching my my expertise a little bit, but I think the air quality monitors are primarily monitoring particulate matter 2.5 and 10 and some gases like NOx and other things. They don't measure everything. However, most contaminants track with the things that are measured. So if you were getting an okay reading, it was probably okay. If you visibly saw a plume of smoke or had ash falling from the sky, but no smoke, or had an okay reading, but you had ash that wasn't getting picked up by those monitors, then I would say you were probably being impacted negatively. But Tevin or Silverio, do you have anything to add about the air quality monitoring?
A lot of air quality monitoring is dependent upon the skill of the people that are doing the monitoring and who's doing it. There are a couple of air monitoring and resource companies that corporations tend to go with because they always seem not to find what they don't want to find. We dealt with that in East Palestine. They're dealing with it now in the battery fire. I was listening to the EPA person that was on scene there dealing with the battery fire, saying that he didn't know what to look for. Well, it's hydrogen fluoride. And now that it hits the air, get a piece of pH paper and wave it around and you're going to find it. But how do you not know what to look for? This is what you're dealing with, along with the other stuff that involves the plastics that are burning. But when you burn this stuff, a lot of what you're going to find is going to be directly dependent upon what burned in the given area. So, you have when buildings burn and automobiles burn, you're going to get heavy metals such as lead, copper. Older homes may release the asbestos. Believe it or not, a lot of the plaster post 1930s, when they got rid of horses, they used fiberglass in the base coats of the old plaster. You could have plastics and electronics loaded with all kind of stuff that are giving off all kind of noxious fumes. Getting back into the dioxins and the polyfluorinated biphenyls, like Tevin mentioned, they can contaminate the water and the soil. And again, the ash, if it's in the ash, it's going to precipitate out. One of the things I'm kind of noted for is at the Norfolk Southern, I was the one that said, we basically nuked the town with chemicals to get a railroad through. And the reason why I said that was because after they blew up the vinyl chloride cars, you had these people's ring cameras, and it got all dark. You seen the cloud, and then all of a sudden you seen this particulate matter coming down. And in that particulate matter was all the dioxins, all the furans, all of these, arsenic, leads, uh, all kind of stuff, as along with your benzene, toluene, naphthalene, furans, furanols, and all these other chemicals. You really don't know what to test for. And one of the things that I like to always go with, and I was talking to Diana about it, when you're inside of a fire, I remember young firemen, we would, and these are modern fires, young fireman would look up in the corner and you'd see all these black cobwebs. I mean, there's a ton of them. And he'd just like, hey, I was a captain at the time. Say, Cap, I'm surprised this nice house has that many cobwebs up in the corners. And I said, no, they're not cobwebs. What they are is soot that's reconstructed itself, and they look like cobwebs. They're the long chain plastics that have congealed together with the soot, and they've strung themselves out in the corners. They call them soot tags, and they look like black spider webs. But this is what you get. And a lot of times these things are missed when you're doing aerial monitoring. And a lot of times what they do is they try to couch it in time weighted averages, or, acute exposure or chronic exposure. Well, you're not getting, so there's not that much, but yeah, there's not that much, but over 30 years, what are we talking about here? Or, well, you're allowed so much in 8 hours. Again, yes, but these people are living here. So they're living here not just for 8 hours, they're living here for 24 hours. Yeah.
Silvio, you had mentioned when you told me about those cobwebs, and we Googled photographs of them. They're so kind of gothic and crazy looking, that they also accumulate, you said arsenic and other metals that
Yeah.
are burning in the home. Yeah.
They're sticky. And when these are like soot, and, these are your plastics that are forming back into chains, and they just catch stuff. And it's, when you hit them, you see dust fly off of them. And in that dust is everything that burned in the homes, from the copper. We found cobalt in a couple of them, because some people like to collect cobalt glass. And there's a ton of things. And even with the flame retardants that are being used in LA, uh, the part that most of it is, ammonia phosphate, which is basically a fertilizer. But environmental and science technology letter researchers found high levels of metals like chromium and cadmium in some of the flame retardants that were being used at the LA fire. So, the newer formulas don't have them, but again, if they're using some of the older formulas, it could have been possibly present. So you really don't know what's there, and how much is it going to cost, and how long will it take to test for everything?
Right. Well, I want to move us into some solutions, because I know that people are coming to this call. We're all, deeply concerned. But let me turn us toward in the solution direction. And this is a question for Cassidy. How can plastic use in our built environment be reduced?
Sure. Well, I'll expand on what I was saying earlier about personal choices. And we work at Habitable, we really work at the market intervention side to try to shift the market demand by working with large purchasers, for large purchasers to prefer the better materials. But policy initiatives, like I said, are going to be increasingly important. There's a lot of things that go into a potential solution, and the first to back up would be to the transparency issue. Tevin mentioned that we don't always know what's in these building products, so transparency, and then using the resources we do have to make better decisions at every level. In terms of rebuilding after a fire and policy initiatives, I mentioned government procurement policies has been something that's been proposed. We have a policy brief that I hope we can share with everybody after this call.
I think we
that
actually shared it to the whole
Oh,
group in the
great.
chat. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so that has some policy solutions that are yeah, in there.
Don't
But
laugh at me, but I'm very solution oriented. So for example, if you said to me, I've noticed a lot of my clothing have synthetics in it, what should I aim for instead? I would recommend cotton and wool and, linen and silk and cashmere and natural based materials, hemp. So what just off the top of your head are some of the things you might recommend? Because I feel like when I drive around and I see building sites, I see Tyvek everywhere. I see, what would you recommend just off the top of your head as
Sure. Well,
better building materials, please?
It depends on the product category as to what has good options. But for instance, in flooring, linoleum is a very low plastic product. If you need a resilient floor that's not polyvinyl chloride, which would be like vinyl flooring or WPC, SPC, those click vinyl tiles. An alternative might be linoleum, which has almost no plastic in it. Most have almost no plastic in them. Wood flooring, obviously concrete, sealed concrete. That sort of thing. For insulation, there's the mineral wools and cellulose insulations. Certain categories are not great. They need innovation. We need better choices, and we don't have them for, like, for instance, low slope roofing or flat roofing. It's largely plastic or very heavily petrochemical based materials, and we don't have a lot of great options. But for most of the interior finishes, there are almost always no and low plastic solutions. The difficulty for a consumer, an individual consumer, is that you don't always know, and there is a lot of greenwashing to say this is a bioplastic or it's bio-based polyurethane, or it's a natural eco wood, but it's a huge percentage plastic because it's a composite wood. So it's really really tough to know. So don't beat yourself up if you're out there trying to make decisions and it seems difficult. It is difficult, and sometimes it feels like it's difficult by design. But yeah, if you're rebuilding your home and you're needing resources, please look at our website. It's a product type approach. So you'll see like linoleum flooring versus wood flooring versus LVC or LVT rather versus all the other product type approach. So start there, reduce what you can. You can think about it for price. If you're an individual who's purchasing these things for your home, what can you do? Paint is a big one. There are like small swaps you can make with paint, and it covers a large surface area. Flooring covers a large surface area. So yeah, do what you can. Start small. There are no and low cost options for better materials in a lot of product categories.
And sorry, would that be like non-VOC paints or?
Sure, yeah. For plastics, if you're using a latex paint, it's plastic. So yeah, low VOC or high VOC, it's still a plastic product. But choosing a low VOC, and there are a couple other attributes for a latex paint that would make it better. There's also mineral silicate paints, which have a much lower plastic content, typically around like 5% versus like 25-ish%. And lime paint, of course, or other alternative wall finishes that aren't paint. Latex paint is tricky though, because it's a plastic product. I think a recent study was like 18% of all the microplastics in our oceans and waterways were from architectural paint. So it's a problem that needs to be solved, and another place that innovation is crucially needed for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. And Tevin, yeah.
I want to add something to Cassidy. Something that's so important also, I think, as part of the solution conversation is we need to do a much better job about education on these things. We need to do a much better job of educating the public. What products in your houses come from plastics? Where do plastics come from? They come from fossil fuels. What are the alternatives? If we do have alternatives and we do have solutions, it's really important that we can relay those messages out to people, especially when they're rebuilding. Because if people don't know that it's an issue in the first place, they're going to continue to doing the same thing. So public education and outreach on why this is an issue in the first place, about the entire life cycle of plastic, about how it gets into our home and how it affects our day-to-day life, is an increasingly important point that I think we really need to hammer down home on. Public education on the issue in hand.
Yeah.
And thank you, Plastic Pollution Coalition, for doing webinars that help.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you all for making the time to be part of this. Quick question. I'm going to take us through the last questions. This might be for Silverio, but everyone's welcome to chime in. What would you recommend? What can be done to make our homes more fire resistant?
Well, 30 years ago, I built my own home, and I built it as a firefighter. You want to use dimensional lumber. You don't want to use anything that are micro lams or composites or anything. They get this new thing out they're trying to sell. It's an I-beam. Basically what it is, it's a 2x4 with another 2x4 and some OSB in between the two. Oriented strand boards, OSB. Those are filled with glues. They'll burn. You don't want to use that. when you build your house now, some of the new stuff out there, it's called dense glass sheetrock. You can use it instead of the Tyvek outer coating. You can use the dense glass sheetrock. It wasn't available when I was there, but I just used something that was non-flammable. Getting away from vinyl siding. Um, Vinyl siding is nothing more than solid gasoline, and it burns just like it. Some of the worst fires I've ever had were vinyl siding that was burning. You can actually now purchase what's called a fiber cement siding. It's a little bit more durable, and to be totally honest, it's probably going to cost 10 to 20% more to build your house this way, but it's going to last, especially in areas that are prone to fires. I made sure I had double pane windows in my house. That gives you some insulation from the heat. I didn't have to worry about it so much here, but in places that are prone to fires, you want to use no vents in your peaks, no vents in your soffits, because that's where the channeling of the air is bringing. If you noticed in the LA fires, first the attics caught fire. A lot of it was being brought in from the vents and the soffits and the vents at the top of the house. You want to make sure that's to make sure your insulation is a glass insulation. It's not going to burn. Interior of your homes, use 5/8 fireboard. That buys you at least 1 hour worth of burn time. Hardwood doors. If you have a fire in a room, you could shut the door. You have at least a 1 hour burn through time if you're using 5/8 drywall and hardwood doors. On the outside of your house, keep everything away from your house for 30 feet and make sure your trees are at least 100 feet out. If you have burn pits, keep them 100 feet out. Try to keep coniferous trees away from your house because those quickly warm up, they get dry. And if you've ever watched a pine tree go up, it's like, holy, they burn. I mean, there's like, woof, looks like a,
And eucalyptus too.
yeah, eucalyptus. Yeah, that's the same thing. So these are some of the things you can do. Is it going to cost you more money? Yeah, but in the long run, a lot of people say, what about putting fire sprinklers in your house? That's directly dependent upon your insurance company and your area. Most insurance companies will charge you extra for the sprinklers, and basically their reasoning is because they have had more experience with somebody breaking the sprinkler heads and causing more damage than actually protecting the fire. The only way they'll not charge you more if your area is actually has it as part of their zoning regulations. These are some of the things from this is what I did.
Thank you. Thanks for all of that. Great advice. So we're getting near to the end of the time that we had together. I know we were able to answer lots of questions in the Q&A online as well. I wanted to ask each of you if you just had some last comments that you'd like to share with the people tuning in about this. I know it's ongoing. Our work is ongoing, and I appreciate your comments. And why don't we start with Tevin?
Once again, I want to thank you for allowing me to be here. My comments are, I think the LA fires are like a really stark reminder of the urgent need to transition away from fossil fuels and reduce the life cycle of plastic from its extraction to the production to the end of this waste and disposal. And I also want to take the time to kind of uplift some of the communities that were strongly impacted by these fires. For example, 61% of Black households in Altadena were located within the fire perimeter, compared to just 50% of non-Black residents, and 48% of Black households were destroyed or sustained major damage. One thing in the Black community, the passing of generational wealth primarily happens through the passing of land, property, and like homes. So to see that half those homes that were belong to like Black people that were destroyed makes it increasingly harder to like pass on generational wealth in our community, in the Black community and communities of color. So just shedding light on how the LA fires really drastically impacted people's way of lives, their businesses, their homes, and the Black community in Altadena may never be the same due to this disaster. So it's really important just to understand how this issue, the root cause of it is just oil and gas, oil and drilling and fossil fuels, and we phase away from that, we can severely reduce the amount of impact from these disasters. And the last thing I want to plug is Environmental Justice Communities Against Plastic, the coalition that I help coordinate, which is home to 6 organizations that are addressing the entire life cycle across California. We are constantly doing work to help our community's way of life and just, in the public health impacts. And thank you all.
Thank you for that, Tevin. Let's go to Cassidy.
Sure. Thank you for being here, and thanks for putting these webinars on. This and all the other work that you do is really great to have that. And I just want to end on a positive note that Silveria and I both listed a lot of things and products, and it can seem overwhelming, or it can seem cost prohibitive, or it can seem impossible. And I just want to end on a note to say there are no and low plastic building materials that are available today that are better from a fire safety perspective and better from a plastic and material health perspective. And you can make those changes and start small. And as a society, we can make those changes. Even if they're small seeming changes, they're definitely a step in the right direction.
Great, thank you for that. Silverio?
Just as Cassidy said, the slow moving from you're not going to get a drastic change, but if we every day do something a little bit to change our habits. A lot of the problems you're running into in some of these fires, especially in LA, is the chemicals that you keep right underneath your sink. When you go buy your detergents, when you go buy your house chemicals, look for something that is more eco-friendly, and just don't accept that it's eco-friendly, because there is a lot of greenwashing out there. Greenwashing is they tell you it's safe, but it's only, this is recyclable plastic. Well, no, it's not. They're not going to recycle it. They're saying it's recycled because they want to take it and burn it somewhere. So make sure that the product is more eco-friendly. When you rebuild houses, try to use some of the practices that we discussed. When you're looking at making improvements in your house, try to implement those. One of the things that I can tell you about the way they used to build homes is when I was a firefighter, if I had a home that was built before 1970, I knew I had about an hour's worth of time I could play in a house before it started to structurally become unsafe. Some of the newer houses, they're falling into the basements by the time the first due engine company arrives. So, that's telling you something.
That's
Before
right.
plastics, after plastics, this is what you're dealing with. It's throwing the fire service, in a tizzy. And support your firefighters. Make sure they've got what they need to do the job. No excuses. Don't want to hear, oh, we can't afford this, we can't afford that. You're paying for an insurance policy, and those guys got to be, they're there. Yeah, they might spend the whole day really not doing anything, but in the middle of the night, when something happens and you need them, they're going to be there. I guarantee it. So, don't fall for the crap that, well, they only had so many runs. Yeah, but the most important run is the run to your house. Make sure they're there to do it.
That's right. Thank you, Silverio. I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists. And of course, thank you, very much gratitude to all of the firefighters who put their lives on the line every day to help everyone and to protect us. So I fully support that. I want to thank our panelists, though, Silverio, Cassidy, and Tevin, for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and insights. I know this could be, we could talk for another couple hours about it, because it's a very dynamic, robust conversation. And I thank you. Thank you for providing useful information, your guidance. We greatly appreciate this conversation. And thank you to all of our attendees for tuning in. Please mark your calendars for our next webinar on March 20th. It's called Grasping at Straws, Policy Solutions for Safe Drinking Water. If you haven't already, we invite you to join our global coalition. It is currently free to join as an individual, business, or nonprofit organization. And you can connect with us on social media to learn more about our work. We will be sending out a follow-up survey after the webinar, and we'd appreciate your feedback to help us continue to improve our future events. We will also send out the recording of this webinar in the coming days so that you can share it with anyone who was unable to join us today. Thanks again to everyone for joining. Thanks also to our Plastic Pollution Coalition member groups and partners who shared this webinar with their communities and their networks. And we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar on March 20th. See you soon. Bye.